When it comes to our protagonists in One Piece, there are a lot of mysteries that have lingered since the very beginning of this story. Some of these include, who is Luffy's mother? And is there anything special about the bloodline and lineage of our MC?
And while we have learned some things, through mostly the will of D that Luffy's inherited, a lot of these mysteries still remain without any real clear answers. However, we do think that we may have an answer to one of the biggest unknowns, and that being, who are Luffy's true ancestors?
And in this theory, we're not suggesting anything like re-inheriting will, or how people used to believe that Luffy was a direct descendant of Joy Boy from a long time ago. But instead, we wanted to propose somebody that we have met in the story quite a while ago, actually. So, just to give a short version of our theory, we believe that Luffy and the Monkey D family are descendants of Shandora, and that this might have been alluded to by a number of different background details, character introductions, and foreshadowing and dialogue that we just glossed over in our first time through.
And if this is true, we also want to ask, what can the story arc of Skypiea specifically tell us about Luffy's future in the final few arcs that are still to come in the story?
But before we get into breaking down the evidence supporting this theory, we want to give a big credit to both Brian Edits over on Instagram and Randy Troy's theory that also goes into Luffy's lineage, as both of them were huge in helping us to collect evidence to put this theory video together.
And to begin outlining our supporting evidence, we'll start with some of the special color spreads and covers that we've seen in the story, starting with color spreads, which there's been a few, from chapter 175, 352, and 431. And in each of these spreads, Luffy is depicted in what appears to be Shandian-like and native apparel, while brandishing very similar weapons to what we've seen from a number of Wyper's warriors, while the others in the color spread might match more of a jungle-like aesthetic.
And like you said, it's interesting because you do see like Nami has some tiger print, and when they're all in the skies, they have like their Skypiea apparel on, except for Luffy, who is very much drawn in this unique style to look more like the characters that exist in only this very small corner of the universe. But to see him repeatedly be singled out in each of these color spreads, it could just be artistic choice, of course. This is all just speculation, but it is interesting to see him continually draw back to that parallel of Luffy adorning these attire over and over again.
And we've already seen multiple times, Oda did have those basic ideas of a lot of the deeper lore that's even just now being revealed in places like Egghead and Elbaf, that he laid in the very groundwork of the story. So it would make sense if he was just like, here's a sprinkle that's only going to make sense years down the road.
Absolutely. And if that's not convincing enough, we can also take a look at volume cover 27, which in this cover we see Luffy not only winking at the audience in a somewhat of a very cheeky way to say there might be more up their sleeve, but also showcasing a pair of his own Skypiean wings on his back that we see on Wyper, on the people in Skypiea, like Conus and her father.
Yeah, it once again draws a very notable parallel of Luffy to these Sky Warriors, and the image has also been used in some theories, including our own. He could be the eventual eye patch pirate that Oda has always dreamt of drawing within the story.
But it could also be used with the purpose of alluding to more. Like, yes, this is a fun color spread idea, this is a fun art style to put Luffy into, but it's always kind of stood out as very unique and interesting, and maybe that's because he was being very deliberate that him showing him with wings has a lot more to it than just some fun art.
Exactly, and as we'll discuss later, there could be multiple things foreshadowed in one piece of art that has multiple meanings, has multiple ties, because that's the thing with One Piece, it's never just one thing. There's multiple past storylines that are actually written between the lines.
Absolutely, and callbacks are also what make those things stand out even more. And let's look at one of those callbacks as we look at one of our first examples of background details with a character introduction that's not just applied to Luffy, but obviously, if he were a true descendant of Kalgara, so would his father and grandfather. And when we first meet Kalgara, he is throwing this massive cannonball at a ship nearby his island to protect his land. And when we first see Garp's first real attack, he's throwing a huge cannonball at the Going Merry as they're trying to escape that looks pretty much the exact same. So the first real display of power from both of these individuals is essentially the same exact thing. Very much, this is where Luffy gets it from, essentially. And if that's not convincing enough, we also can look at a point of evidence for Dragon being the fact that voice actor Hidekatsu Shibata voices only 2 characters in the entire One Piece universe, one being Monkey D. Dragon, and the other being Kalgara. And while this might not mean an exact one-to-one like it would if you saw the characters in the show have a clear connection, we will point out that even very recently in the story, back in Wano, when voice actor Ryazuburo Otomo voiced Tenguyama Hitetsu and Kozuku Sukiyaki, people were starting to speculate that, okay, maybe these 2 characters are actually the same guy because they're voiced by the same voice actor.
And that's what it ended up being.
Which ended up being true, so you can't say that it's not entirely out of the question for it to be a possibility.
Right, because they actually have done it before.
And it's not as though we're saying they are the same person, just that they share a sort of connection and similarities, which would be possible with a descendant.
Right, and a lot of voice actors in One Piece, they'll kind of bounce around, they'll do many characters. It's the fact he's only done these 2 specific characters.
Mm-hmm. One that we haven't seen much of at all, and one that only appeared once in the story.
Yeah. It definitely doesn't seem like coincidence.
No. But there is more evidence for Luffy as well, as, while not an element of the story itself that we see in the narrative, as a part of the SBS that Oda releases to kind of expand the world building of One Piece, back in chapter 549, volume 56, Oda would share the nationalities of all of the Straw Hats with us, audience.
Exactly. And out of the nations mentioned, the one for our captain was revealed to be Brazil. And Brazil is the same country that is home to 60% of the Amazon, where El Dorado, or the inspiration for the Golden City, is hypothesized to have existed. And while Luffy may have originated from Dawn Island, his heritage seems to align with the idea that his roots stem back to Shandora, the City of Gold.
Absolutely. A lot of the details make it seem like he or a past version of him has already kind of been here before.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll touch on it more, but he can feel it. Like, he believed that it existed before he'd ever seen it. All that he'd heard about it once. And he's like, yes, this is a real place. I will go there.
Even when everyone made fun of him, it's kind of like an estranged sense of home, I guess.
Right, where he's like, no one will convince me otherwise. This place is real, and I will see it.
Absolutely, and even in the Golden City itself, when looking at the Golden Bell, a central point of the conflict of the entire arc, when you look at the top of the bell, what do you see but what looks like the silhouette of a monkey wearing a straw hat? So, perhaps this is just a fun Easter egg. Perhaps Oda was just kind of enjoying himself creating the paneling.
But we're starting to mention a lot of things that could maybe just be, and Skypiea has always been one of those things where it's, if you truly understand One Piece, there's so much in there.
Yeah.
There's so many building blocks of the deeper lore of the entire history of the world just kind of drip through there. Why couldn't this be another one?
And perhaps it's not so weird that it's just monkeys on a bell, because if they truly did descend from Shandora, that would mean at one point the Monkey D family would have originated from this land. So if they were already a prominent family there, what's to say that there wouldn't be some kind of designs or sigils or symbols that would allude to this very prominent and strong family?
Exactly. And we have 3 members of his current family living: Luffy himself, Dragon, and Garp. And all of them, in a very noticeable way, can be compared to members of that past family of Kalgara.
And let's start by looking at Luffy, because Luffy has a very unique appearance to him. There's a lot of females in One Piece that people will say kind of just look like a Nami clone, because Oda does kind of take a lot of similar stereotypical design elements into females. But when it comes to males, and more specifically our protagonist, we don't really see many people that look like him, but we do in this flashback with Kalgara, and that being his future son-in-law, Seto.
Yeah, I mean, you put them side by side, their face shape, their build, their hair, their eyes, it all just looks eerily similar. And again, like you said, it's something that he doesn't really resemble anyone else. Even Dragon, he has a little bit of features where it's like, oh, the hair's a little bit similar, but this guy, it's so much more comparable, more than anyone else in the story.
Yeah, the only person that's close is like Garp when he was younger, who is his direct descendant. Yeah. But let's talk about Dragon, because when you put him and Kalgara side by side in a similar manner to Seto and Luffy, they also have incredibly similar builds, incredibly similar hair.
I would say almost even more so.
Yeah, they look kind of like if you just put a different hairstyle on Dragon, he could pass for Kalgara.
Yeah, and then you take into the fact the tattoos. His face tattoo, which has always been like one of the most prominent parts of Dragon's character. It's comparable to, like, whether it's tattoos or face paint, the same things that we see on Shandoran Knights.
And in multiple scenes, when Wyper is younger, or just in Kalgara's design on his clothes, you see that crisscross like diamond pattern that he has on that tattoo. And he didn't always have it, but once we like see that he got it, that's when the revolution really kind of like started to take off for him. So maybe he got in touch with his roots, and that really lit the fire even more than perhaps God Valley or something else.
Right, it's a true like homage or tribute to his true heritage.
But even Garp is not exempt from this comparison, as when we first saw Garp in the beginning of the story, before we knew anything about him, he was wearing this dog hat mask on top of his head. No other Marine was wearing anything like that. But we know who is Shandorans. All the way back in the day, the chieftains, the village leaders were wearing these very similar headpieces. And like we had said, his first shown attack of throwing those large cannonballs is just a 1-to-1 to Kalgara's first display of power as well. So he might not have the exact physical resemblance as his son and his grandson, but he does still seem to carry those small cultural features with him in a way that no other character does outside of Shandora.
And to go even further, beyond the actions that we've seen, there's also words, both from flashbacks and current times, like within the story itself, that help foreshadow and draw connections between Luffy, his family, and Kalgara's family.
And perhaps the most damning of all of this would be a sort of prophecy that Wyper himself had said when they were in the middle of this confrontation with Enel. He claimed that only a descendant of Kalgara could ring the bell, but it wasn't necessarily the one he thought it would have been. Because in his mind, that might have just been a hyperimposed self-destiny prophecy he was setting for himself. But perhaps he also wasn't wrong. It was just a relative he was unaware that he had.
Right, and like, it hasn't been proven that he was, like, it could have just been him saying that. But again, destiny, fate, that's like a huge part of this story. Always has been, continues to be. What if, yeah, he was right about this all? That it was just a long down the line descendant, being Luffy, who was ultimately gonna fulfill this prophecy.
He was the one that rang the bell, so if his prophecy meant anything to Wyper, that might be something else to tell the audience in kind of a indirect way.
The same way he knew to go there in the first place, that's just where he belonged. It was calling him back.
It's where he needed to be, yeah. But it's not just about who Luffy is necessarily, because Luffy's more than just Garp's grandson. He's more than Dragon's son. He's more than just a pirate. He is now the sun god as well. And wouldn't you know that the very first person who ever mentioned the sun god also happened to be related to Kalgara?
Yeah, crazy, first off. But literally, the first ever mention we actually got explicitly of the sun god came from Kalgara's own daughter. And it was her giving comfort to her mother as she was crying because she had been chosen, the daughter, Moose, of a sacrifice. That her life was to be given. And she was, don't cry. I'm going to meet the sun god. It's an honor to be chosen to save my people.
And in the story, I do think they believed it was the giant snake, but to explicitly name drop the sun god, it's so interesting, but who better to bring up the idea of the future sun god than one of his ancestors? So it's just another point or coincidence to toss on the pile.
And especially, like, even looking forward, like, Luffy didn't choose this. He still doesn't understand fully how important it is that he is the sun god. And even though she did, she was like, I didn't get to pick this. It's just an honor to have this given to me.
Mm-hmm. And just to revisit Seto, just because this is more of an obscure point, but I think it's at least worth mentioning. We've looked at Seto for his physical appearance, but he also has a kind of a tie to Luffy's more godlike side, as you can look at sun gods in any number of religions, but Seto's name also is the Japanese pronunciation of the Egyptian god Set, brother of Ra, the sun god. And he is the god of storms, which might seem obscure at first, but it could also hold a lot more significant meaning.
Well, because that's what we assume is tied to the direct powers of Dragon. Because when he first appeared in the story, he comes in and leaves like a flash of lightning, with some storm clouds. Could he have that exact power of the god of the storms?
And take it even a step further, Law on multiple occasions has referred to those with the will of D as people who will always bring a storm without fail, or they're bound to create another storm, which really pissed off Doflamingo. So that, again, association between the storms and these D members, which, again, the most prominent family of them being the Monkey D family. So why not have another connection there between this god of storms who could be their ancestor and now the current Stormbringers of this Monkey D family? So, with this in mind, if we were to assume that Luffy was truly a descendant of Kalgara, it would also make sense that Oda would introduce a sort of Nolan counterpart to him, because they are a pair. They're a pair of brothers. The whole story and flashback was about their bond.
Yeah, their relationship was the entire catalyst for what they both became.
So it would only make sense for Oda to introduce somebody else, maybe even a descendant of Nolan, that would immediately bond and be best friends with Luffy in a similar way. And just so happens that we have one person on our crew that very much has been drawn parallels to Nolan before, and is arguably considered Luffy's best friend, being Usopp.
Yeah, they immediately hit it off with each other. They both have this happy-go-lucky vibe. And Luffy also was the one who drew Usopp to explore his dreams. To not just talk about being a pirate, but actually become one. And it would just add a whole nother layer to Mont Blanc Cricket, who is the one who basically led them to Skypiea.
He started the whole Skypiea.
Yeah, he's the only reason they got there. They don't get there without him.
And even he was immediately kind of allegiant to their dream and their cause to get to the sky. And in return, Luffy was incredibly loyal when his friend was robbed and wronged by Bellamy, so far that he said, I need to unbesmirch his family's name. I need to prove that Nolan wasn't just a liar, because I also kind of believe this.
Yeah, and then he, being Cricket, even said explicitly that he believes people should follow their dreams even when they're laughed at by others. And that's exactly what Luffy did. That's exactly what drove him to fight in that moment against Bellamy.
So perhaps we don't have just one example. Perhaps there's multiple that have proved that Luffy, as a descendant of Kalgara, could immediately make a connection with somebody who is exactly like Nolan in the same way that his ancestor did. So, if all of these points can be considered, at least with a sense of truth, that it might point towards this idea that Luffy is a Shandoran or a descendant of Kalgara, that adds a whole new level of significance to Skypiea. So why don't we look at the arc itself a little bit closer?
And we'll start with Wyper and Luffy's connection. And basically, time and time again throughout this entire story, it has become so clear that destiny, fate, whatever you want to call it, it's a core part of the entire One Piece story. There has always been these prophecies, these things that have been written and come to pass that drive history forward. So it would only make sense that Wyper telling Enel, this is who will defeat you. It will be one of my descendants. Like, that isn't just something he said as a one-off comment. It's a hidden clue. And it would also just be very in character of Luffy to not even know that when he did it. To not even realize his true history of his lineage. Just like he doesn't understand, even to this day, the importance of his Nika powers and appearance. But it would also be very in character of Dragon to know this, but not tell Luffy. Just let him reach that on his own.
Yeah, I mean, you can't try to force fate to happen. That's kind of the whole point. It happens regardless, and it's not as though there's no free will, because there's plenty of that within the story.
And he did step in the one time he had to, but he still didn't say anything. He still didn't tell Luffy who he was. He just saved him and dipped, and knew that he would continue on his journey. And we've seen in the recent Kuma flashbacks that he was keeping an eye on him. He's always known. He's kept an eye on him and made sure that he follows his path.
I mean, perhaps Dragon even kind of knew this might have been the fate of his son. But like Moose said, it's kind of an unavoidable honor to just have. You can't change it, no matter what your personal wants are.
And Luffy being himself, just doesn't even know. Just fills the shoes that he walks into.
But I also do think Skypiea tells us more about what to expect in the endgame instead of just about our main character, because Skypiea, like you had mentioned, has kind of been called like a microcosm of the whole story. So it would also make sense that the ultimate climax of that arc should mirror the ultimate climax we get of the story.
Yeah, and we've already done this in a video before, but Enel was a good precursor to what Emu ends up being, which is a self-declared and then created usurped god who rules over people with an iron fist.
So I think he would draw a lot of joy from a death game that Enel created, and I honestly think that would be more fitting than like something we saw like Marineford, which was just kind of unbridled chaos everywhere. Instead, I think I could very much see the final war in the final saga being Emu, this overpowering force.
Well, and even before you finish that, there'll be a war, there'll be other people fighting, but the true final battle.
Yes. The like true battle royale of the strongest allies Luffy has.
The culmination.
And everything the world government has on their table. And I think that it could end up in a very similar situation where instead of Wyper, this time it's another descendant of Kalgara, being Luffy, standing alongside 3 or 4 other people as they are in this final showdown against Emu instead of Enel in this time. And perhaps this might just be our own canon for our own fan theory, but how awesome would it be to have Luffy, Shanks, Zoro, and Sanji staring down Emu in this final conflict?
It would be amazing. And when you really think about it, it kind of adds up and compares to what it was with Wyper, where you've got 2 people he's directly connected to in Zoro and Sanji, and then kind of an outside party, quotes, being Shanks, but also with his direct ties having also helped guide Luffy to this point.
Plus, Luffy might not have wings like a normal Skypiean or Shandoran, but he does have his wings of the Pirate King at his side.
Exactly. Like, just such a fitting name for the 2 he needs them. And like, obviously Zoro is his vice captain, the first person to join his crew. But then Sanji too. I think it'd be a beautiful way to call back to what he had to say to him in Whole Cake. I can't finish this without you. I need you to become Pirate King.
Yeah.
That would truly bring it to fruition.
And if all of what we have said has not been convincing enough to you, we just want to zero in one more time on that Kalgara and Nolan flashback and just why it was so important. not just for helping build up the emotional significance of this conflict of multiple centuries of people fighting for their freedom, but also why it was even included in the first place. Because when you look at all the flashbacks beforehand, it is directly tied to somebody the Straw Hats have met or are themselves, but it is somebody who is currently living until this one.
Yeah, everything else was backstory on someone we've already met, we've already gotten to know in the current time. This was, and especially now, knowing how important the unknown history is to the core of the story. This was the first time we were introduced to, here are people the crew isn't going to meet, that aren't from this time, that come from before. And that would drive you to believe that they are a central, pivotal part of the true story within the story of One Piece.
And often you could just say these two kind of laid the groundwork for what became the final conflict in Skypiea. But what if they also just laid the groundwork for the person who would change the world themselves? What if the reason they really wanted to key in on these two brothers is because what they would create and that kind of special bond is something that you also see Luffy create with people everywhere he goes.
I mean, if Blackbeard's gonna have a special lineage, I would only assume Luffy's is even more special.
So, that is all the evidence we have put together for this. And after looking at the recent Three Worlds History mural that we found in Elbaf, it only seems right that Luffy would have a tie to each of these worlds that really come together and culminate in him being the champion of all of them.
Exactly, and he takes a part of each one of their beings and just kind of embodies all of them at once, what all of them combined would create. Which, in the first world, it would be, obviously, the sun god Nika. The second world, Joy Boy, who was at one point a hero, but maybe played a part in the destruction, but ultimately was a champion for good as well. And then, halfway through the third world, which he would eventually save, is currently saving, exactly halfway through Kalgara, because he lived 400 years ago.
And there's nothing else really from that time that we know about.
Yeah.
He just really wanted to get this story in there.
The only other person that we really know of around 400 years ago is in Elbaf right now, the oldest giant currently, Jarul.
So, these could just be a number of coincidences, but to have so many of them pop up and point back to what could be the same connection over and over again, we just wanted to bring this to your attention and put it in a way so that you guys can give us your thoughts and whether or not you think this could be true.
And again, as we stated at the beginning of this video, we want to give huge props to Brian Edits on Instagram and Randy Troy here on YouTube for all of the research that they had done into helping us build this theory. So let us know in the comments, do you agree with us on our theory? Do you have any additional observations that you also want to throw in that we maybe didn't even touch on, or that you want to continue on? Or do you even maybe have an alternative explanation to counter our argument? Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed our discussion, and most importantly, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel to join our growing pirate fleet and continue with us as we really dive into this final saga and everything as it takes place.
And the most important thing, as always,
Be crew!